From the early 1600s through the late 1800s, Native American tribes across North America faced mass violence as European settlers, and later the United States expanded westward. This expansion was driven by land acquisition, economic interest, and political control. As settlers moved into indigenous territories, conflicts became frequent and often deadly. Over time, these conflicts turned into organized campaigns that aimed to remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands entirely. Massacres were a common feature of this period. Armed militias and US soldiers attacked native villages, often targeting non-combatants such as women, children, and the elderly. In several regions, including California during the Gold Rush, state authorities encouraged settlers to carry out violent actions against native populations. Financial rewards were offered for killing Native Americans, and entire communities were wiped out. As a result, the native population in California declined sharply within a few decades. Forced removal was another major tactic. The US government passed laws that required native tribes to relocate west of the Mississippi River. The most well-known example is the Trail of Tears, during which the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes were forced to march long distances under harsh conditions. Thousands died due to hunger, disease, and exposure. Starvation warfare was also widely used. Soldiers destroyed crops, killed livestock, and burned food stores to weaken native resistance. By eliminating access to food, the government forced tribes into submission. In some cases, military leaders openly stated that starving native populations was more effective than direct combat. There is also historical evidence of biological warfare. Smallpox outbreaks devastated native communities, and in certain instances, infected blankets were deliberately distributed to spread disease. Even when disease spread unintentionally, government officials often ignored the suffering or used it to their advantage. By the late 1800s, most surviving Native Americans were confined to reservations. Their cultural practices were suppressed, children were taken to boarding schools, and traditional ways of life were dismantled. The Philippine-American War began after the United States took control of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War. Filipino revolutionaries had already fought Spain for independence and believed they would gain freedom once Spanish rule ended. Instead, the United States established control over the islands, leading to growing tension and eventually open conflict in 1899. At first, Filipino forces fought using traditional military tactics, but they were outmatched by American firepower. Over time, Filipino fighters turned to guerrilla warfare, using ambushes and surprise attacks. In response, the United States military adopted harsh counterinsurgency methods that had severe consequences for civilians. One of the most documented abuses during the war was the use of torture. American soldiers employed a method known as the water cure, in which prisoners were forced to swallow large amounts of water until they felt they were drowning. This technique was used to extract information or punish suspected rebels. Reports of these acts reached the United States, but accountability was limited. Civilians were also frequently targeted. US troops burned villages, destroyed homes, and killed residents suspected of supporting resistance fighters. Entire communities were forced into reconcentration camps, where food was scarce and disease spread quickly. These camps caused widespread suffering and death among civilians who were not involved in combat. One of the most brutal episodes occurred on the island of Samar after Filipino fighters killed American soldiers in the town of Balangiga. In retaliation, General Jacob Smith ordered his troops to kill anyone capable of bearing arms and to destroy villages. His orders led to the deaths of many civilians, including children. By the time the war officially ended in 1902, tens of thousands of Filipinos had died from violence, hunger, and disease. During World War II, the United States adopted a strategy known as strategic bombing. This approach focused on attacking entire cities rather than only military targets. The goal was to destroy industrial production and weaken civilian morale. American bombers carried out large-scale air raids over Germany and Japan. These raids often targeted densely populated urban areas. High-altitude bombing made precise targeting difficult, which meant that homes, schools, and hospitals were frequently destroyed alongside factories. Civilians were killed in large numbers, often with little warning. Incendiary bombs played a major role in these campaigns. These weapons were designed to start fires, and when dropped in large quantities, they created firestorms that spread rapidly through wooden buildings. Cities such as Hamburg and Dresden in Germany suffered enormous destruction. In Japan, the effects were even more severe due to the construction materials used in urban housing. One of the deadliest air raids occurred in March 1945 when American forces bombed Tokyo. The attack caused massive fires that burned large parts of the city. An estimated 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night, making it one of the deadliest bombing raids in history. Many victims died from burns, smoke inhalation, or suffocation. At the time, there were few international laws regulating aerial warfare. Military leaders argued that these bombings would shorten the war and reduce future casualties. However, the scale of civilian death raised serious moral and ethical questions. In August 1945, near the final stages of World War II, the United States carried out 2 atomic bombings on Japan. These attacks remain the only use of nuclear weapons in war and caused devastation on a level never seen before. On August 6, 1945, a US B-29 bomber dropped a uranium bomb called Little Boy over Hiroshima. The explosion occurred about 600 meters above the ground and instantly destroyed much of the city. Around 70 to 80,000 people were killed within seconds, and by the end of that year, the total number of deaths rose to about 140,000. Most of the victims were civilians, including children, men, and women, who were simply going about their daily routines. The blast produced a massive fireball and temperatures higher than the surface of the sun. Entire neighborhoods vanished, and thousands more suffered severe burns and radiation injuries. The city's hospitals were destroyed, leaving survivors with no medical help. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 bomber dropped a plutonium bomb called Fat Man on Nagasaki. The bomb exploded over a valley city surrounded by mountains, flattening entire districts and killing an estimated 60 to 80,000 people by the end of that year. Many died instantly, while others perished later from burns, radiation sickness, and infections. The bombings led Japan to surrender on August 15, 1945, officially ending World War II on September 2nd. US leaders argued that using atomic bombs was necessary to avoid a land invasion of Japan, which would have caused massive casualties on both sides. However, many historians and moral thinkers have called the bombings war crimes, pointing to the deliberate targeting of civilian populations. Radiation effects lasted for decades. Survivors faced cancers, birth defects, and chronic illnesses. The cities were rebuilt over time, but the emotional and physical scars never faded. The Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops invaded South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, led military operations to defend the South. The war quickly became one of the most destructive conflicts of the Cold War era, and civilians suffered immensely throughout the fighting. One of the most serious atrocities was the bombing campaign carried out by US forces over North Korea. Cities, towns, and villages were heavily targeted. Air raids dropped millions of tons of explosives and napalm, destroying infrastructure, bridges, dams, and homes. Historians estimate that about 20% of North Korea's population was killed or wounded during the war, many of them civilians. Cities like Pyongyang and Wonsan were almost completely destroyed. The United States sought to weaken North Korea's military and economy, but the results were catastrophic for ordinary people. The most infamous incident was the No Gunri Massacre in late 1950. Hundreds of South Korean refugees, mostly women and children, were trying to flee the combat zone when US troops opened fire. Believing enemy soldiers were hiding among the refugees, the soldiers shot indiscriminately over a period of several days. Reports later revealed that about 163 and over 300 civilians were killed. The event was covered up for decades before being exposed through eyewitness accounts and declassified records. Mass bombing and the destruction of agricultural land also caused famine and disease. Millions of civilians were displaced, living in makeshift camps under constant threat of air raids. Entire families were wiped out, and countless children were orphaned. The Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice but no peace treaty. leaving the Korean peninsula divided to this day. The Vietnam War was one of the longest and most controversial conflicts in modern history. It began as a struggle between communist North Vietnam and non-communist South Vietnam, with the United States supporting the South. Over the years, the war became infamous for its brutality, specifically the treatment of civilians. One of the most horrific events was the My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968. American soldiers entered the village of My Lai and killed more than 300 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Villages were shot while fleeing, others were forced into ditches and executed. Some women were assaulted before being killed. The US military initially hid the truth, but the massacre was later exposed through photographs and testimony from soldiers. Only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted, and he served only a short sentence. Another major atrocity was the use of chemical warfare. From 1962 to 1971, the United States sprayed millions of gallons of Agent Orange over forests and farmlands. The aim was to remove cover for enemy fighters, but the chemical contained dioxin, a poison that caused birth defects, cancers, and long-term illnesses. Generations of Vietnamese civilians and American veterans still suffer the effects today. US bombing campaigns, including Operation Rolling Thunder, destroyed towns, hospitals, and farms. Millions of civilians died or were displaced. The war divided America, leading to protest and political unrest. By the time the war ended in 1975, Vietnam was left in ruins. From 1964 to 1973, the United States carried out large-scale bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War. These bombings were meant to weaken North Vietnamese forces and stop the movement of troops and supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail passed through Laos and parts of Cambodia, even though those countries were not officially at war with the United States at the time. In Cambodia, the bombing began secretly in 1969 under a plan known as Operation Menu. Many members of the US government and the public were not told about it. Large B-52 bombers dropped huge amounts of explosives on rural areas where enemy fighters were believed to be hiding. Over time, the attacks expanded and continued until 1973. Villages were destroyed, farms were burned, and civilians were caught in the middle. Thousands of families lost their homes and food supplies. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians were killed directly by the bombings, with many more dying later from hunger, illness, and displacement. Some estimates place the total number of deaths connected to the bombings as high as several hundred thousand. Laos experienced even heavier bombing. The United States dropped more bombs on Laos than on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Many of these bombs were cluster munitions, which spread smaller explosives over wide areas. A large number did not explode on impact and remain dangerous today. Farmers and children have been injured or killed by these unexploded bombs for decades. The bombing campaigns damaged roads, rivers, schools, and farmland. Entire communities were forced to flee. The destruction weakened local governments and increased stability. In Cambodia, this instability helped extremist groups gain power, which later led to further mass killings. The El Mozote Massacre happened in December 1981 during the Civil War in El Salvador. At the time, the country was divided between a government supported by the United States and rebel groups fighting against it. The war was violent, and civilians were often accused of helping one side or the other. The massacre took place in the village of El Mozo and nearby communities. An elite unit of the Salvadoran army entered the area as part of a military operation. This unit had received training and support linked to the United States. Over several days, the soldiers gathered villagers and killed them. Men were separated from women and children. Many victims were shot at close range. Children were also killed, including babies. Houses, churches, and farms were destroyed. Investigations later found that around 800 people were killed, making it one of the deadliest massacres in Latin American history. Nearly half of the victims were children. Very few survived. Those who did hid in nearby forests and later gave testimony about what they witnessed. For many years, the Salvadoran government denied that the massacre happened. Some officials claimed the reports were false or exaggerated. Early news stories were dismissed, and no one was punished. Years later, forensic investigations uncovered mass graves that confirmed the scale of the killings. On July 3, 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 was shot down by a US Navy warship over the Persian Gulf. The aircraft was a civilian passenger plane traveling from Tehran to Dubai with a stop in Bandar Abbas. There were 290 people on board, including many children and families. No one survived. At the time, the Iran-Iraq War was still ongoing, and the Persian Gulf was heavily militarized. US Navy ships were present to protect shipping routes. The USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser, was involved in a tense encounter with Iranian boats when it detected an aircraft on radar. The crew mistakenly believed the plane was an Iranian military jet preparing to attack. Despite the plane following its normal flight path and sending civilian identification signals, the Vincennes fired 2 missiles. Both struck the aircraft, causing it to break apart in midair and crash into the sea. The incident shocked the world and caused outrage in Iran and many other countries. The United States later stated that the shootdown was a tragic mistake made under stressful conditions. A military investigation found that the crew had misread radar data and made incorrect assumptions. However, the United States did not formally admit legal responsibility. In 1996, the United States agreed to pay compensation to the families of the victims as part of a settlement through the International Court of Justice. The payment was described as an expression of regret, not an admission of fault. In the final days of the Gulf War in February 1991, United States and coalition forces carried out a major attack that later became known as the Highway of Death. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait toward Iraq, a long convoy moved along Highway 80. The convoy included military vehicles, such as tanks and trucks, but it also contained civilian cars and buses. Many of the people on the road were trying to escape the fighting and return home after weeks of war. United States aircraft from the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps attacked the convoy repeatedly over several hours. Bombs and missiles destroyed hundreds of vehicles and left the road covered with burning wreckage. Journalists who visited the site after the attack described a scene of extreme destruction. Burned vehicles were scattered across the highway, and many bodies were found inside cars or lying nearby. Some vehicles still contain personal items, such as suitcases and household goods, suggesting that civilians were present among the retreating forces. No official death count was released by the United States military. Independent estimates vary widely, but some journalists and researchers believe that several hundred people were killed. The attack raised serious ethical and legal questions. Critics argued that Iraqi forces were retreating and no longer posed an immediate threat. International humanitarian law requires armies to distinguish between soldiers and civilians and to avoid excessive force when the military advantage is limited. Human rights organizations questioned whether such a large-scale attack on a retreating convoy met these standards. The war in Afghanistan began in late 2001 after the attacks of September 11. United States and allied forces invaded the country to remove the Taliban government and target extremist groups. Over the next 2 decades, the conflict caused widespread suffering among Afghan civilians. During this time, multiple reports emerged describing serious abuses committed by United States military forces and intelligence agencies. One major area of concern was the treatment of detainees. At detention centers, such as Bagram Air Base, prisoners were held under harsh conditions. Human rights organizations documented cases in which detainees were beaten and chained, deprived of sleep, and denied medical care. Several prisoners died while in United States custody. In 2003, 2 Afghan detainees died at Bagram after being severely beaten by guards. Military medical examiners later ruled these deaths as homicides. These cases raised serious concerns about torture and violations of international law, including the Geneva Conventions. Civilian deaths from airstrikes and drone attacks were another major issue. United States forces relied heavily on air power, especially in rural areas where fighters lived among civilians. In May 2009, an airstrike in Farah province hit homes in farmland, killing dozens of civilians many of them women and children. Afghan officials reported over 100 civilian deaths. The United States later admitted that mistakes were made during the operation. Similar incidents occurred throughout the war, often due to faulty intelligence or misidentification of targets. Night raids and ground operations also contributed to civilian harm. Homes were entered without warning, and families were sometimes injured or killed during searches. Investigations into these incidents were often limited, and few high-level officials faced punishment. For many Afghans, these events deepened anger and mistrust towards foreign forces. The Iraq War began in March 2003, when United States-led forces invaded Iraq and removed Saddam Hussein from power. After the invasion, the country entered a long period of occupation marked by violence, instability, and widespread civilian suffering. During this time, several actions by United States forces drew global condemnation and were widely described as war crimes or serious abuses. One of the most shocking cases involved Abu Ghraib prison. In 2004, photographs emerged showing Iraqi detainees being abused by United States soldiers. Prisoners were beaten, stripped naked, threatened with dogs, and forced into humiliating positions. Some detainees were sexually abused and psychologically tortured. At least several prisoners died due to mistreatment while in custody. The images caused international outrage and severely damaged the credibility of United States claims to promote human rights. Although some low-ranking soldiers were punished, critics argue that senior leaders who approved harsh interrogation methods were never held accountable. Another major incident occurred in the town of Haditha in November 2005. After a roadside bomb killed one United States Marine, other Marines entered nearby homes and killed 25 unarmed Iraqi civilians. The victims included women, elderly men, and children. Early reports falsely claimed the civilians died from the bomb. Later investigations showed they were shot at close range. Only one Marine received a minor punishment, which angered many Iraqis and human rights observers. Beyond these cases, widespread bombing and military operations caused large numbers of civilian deaths. Private security contractors were also involved in deadly incidents, including a 2007 shooting in Baghdad, where 17 civilians were killed. These events contributed to deep resentment among Iraqis and long-term instability. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the US war crimes I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 2 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.